Welcome back to Education Matters. Did you correctly answer false? The Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court is actually elected by voters to serve in that capacity for a full 8-year term. North Carolina is one of only 7 states in which the Chief Justice is elected by voters. We're going to continue our discussion about the midterms with Colin Campbell from The Insider and Jeff Tiberii from WUNC. All right, we started talking about Donald Trump and education, so we're going to shift from Donald Trump and go into education. Obviously, Democrats who are in the very much in the minority in the General Assembly, the Republicans have enjoyed a supermajority now since 2012. They'd like to take over both chambers, but certainly they'll tell you that their goal is at least to break the supermajority. So what does that, I guess first explain to our view, what does that mean, Jeff? Let me ask you, what would that mean if Republicans no longer enjoyed a supermajority but still control both chambers?
Effectively, it gives the governor a much more prominent seat at the table. He or she, of course, Roy Cooper in this case, can ask for much more, can leverage for much more as they sit down to bargain, whether that's about the state budget or Medicaid or whatever the policy issue may be. A supermajority effectively means that legislature passes something by most things by simple majority. It goes to the executive mansion. If the governor, whether it was Perdue or McCrory or now Cooper, if they veto it and it comes back to the legislature has a 3/5 requirement. In some states it's 2/3, so it's actually a little bit lower here. 3/5 requirement to overrule that veto. And if we think about what's happened in the last few years, I think Perdue had early on she had I think it was 11 out of 19 pieces of legislation were overruled, and then with Cooper, I think he's vetoed 25 now pieces of legislation, and 20 of those have come back to the legislature, and they have overridden him on 20 of those. So if they don't have that anymore, the Republicans are going to either have to play nice with Democrats at the legislature, work with them to build some consensus, or just not pass legislation that the governor is going to axe, so to speak.
Right. So that should, yeah, because like you said, the vetoes have largely become symbolic and almost political for a little bit. So I'm going to make a statement on it, but it's not going to. But so let's look at like education, for example. In fact, I remember Governor Perdue. This was one of the things that she went to the mat on some things around education funding. If you don't do this, I'm going to do that. So that's the kind of trading you might see where Democrats could say, all right, you know you're going to pass your budget, but if we get some more investment in teacher pay or in school resources, then it might give the Republicans a little comfort that they either wouldn't be a veto at all or that they could override one?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd have to have a lot of compromise on the front end to try to avoid the veto scenario, because if you end up getting well into next July with no budget, that could be a big problem for state government. So I think there's going to be a lot more leverage in terms of the amount of education funding, the level of the teacher pay raises, as well as some of the more hot-button education issues like, do we spend more on private school voucher programs? What does the funding picture for charter schools look like? Those are all things where we may see more compromise as opposed to just the Republicans passing their agenda and there being no way for Democrats to stop it. And
I mentioned, Jeff, I'll ask you because I mentioned, I was talking to Colin about education. It does seem, and that is a pretty, and it makes sense here in North Carolina because the General Assembly has so much control over education. Right. I mean, I live here in Wake County. All the candidates, Republicans and Democrats, are running as education champions.
Absolutely. This is healthcare, and I mean, we've heard a lot about immigration, but education is so central to state politics and to the candidacies of so many of these folks running for state house and state senate. It's more than 55% of the state budget goes toward education funding. So we've seen all sorts of campaign mailers and attack ads on television. I think a little bit more nuanced. We've also seen, I'll speak to one House race in Wake County, the Joe John Maryland Avila race. And this was a very close race 2 years ago. John unseated Avila. Now Avila is coming back to try to get her old seat back, so to speak. And she has sent out some mailers attacking him for not supporting school safety. And you know, this was something that the legislature kind of diverted toward last winter following the Parkland shooting in Florida, right. Trying to bolster funding for school resource officers and for mental health programs. It was not something John supported, and now she's trying to attack him on that. So we have all sorts of educational funding issues.
Let's talk about something that looms large for education, Supreme Court. I mean, one of the several things that the General Assembly has done in the last few years have been ruled unconstitutional. I don't have the numbers in front of me, maybe you know this, but several laws were overturned, including some on education. I know, like career status and various things. It looks like you know, Anita Earl, certainly based on the polling, the Democrat Anita Earl is likely to be elected next week.
Yeah, I mean, all the signs are pointing in her favor. Of course, the big advantage she has is that the Republicans canceled the primary, so we now have two people who will appear as a Republican on the ballot, which is going to siphon votes away from the incumbent Republican Justice Barbara Jackson. Earls has also raised a ton of money. I think she's over $1 million in her Supreme Court campaign, which is maybe unprecedented for a Supreme Court race. But the upshot of that is we already have a 4-3 majority of Democrats on the court. If she wins, that becomes 5-2, and it's going to stay that way through 2022. So regardless of who's in charge of the legislature, when a Republican law comes before the Supreme Court, the odds that it gets overturned are certainly increased by an Earl's win.
Right, exactly. I mentioned in my headlines, I want to get one more thing in,
Sure.
topic, Margaret Spellings. Big news, big name, national name. This was it was in the Wall Street Journal,
Yeah,
the Chronicle hired last week. This is a very political position, certainly now. I mean, maybe it always has been. I mean, I grew up here, but it's, you know, certainly, you know, Tom Ross was forced out. Spellings, a Bush Republican from Texas, but apparently not to the liking of some of the Board of Governors who were 100% appointed by the legislature.
Right. This is a hyper-partisan moment. The divide is growing, is widening, and I think that as we've seen at the legislature in recent years, as Republicans took over in 10, had the strengthened with supermajorities in 12, it's been we talk about it collectively as a heavy lift because they hadn't been in charge of state government since Reconstruction, and at the same time they hadn't been able to have this kind of control, influence, whatever word you want to use, over the UNC Board of Governors. So we've seen a much more political push. We've seen many more conservative people on the UNC Board of Governors, and it's interesting that Margaret Spellings, who was a key member of George W. Bush's cabinet, is not conservative enough for many of the leaders in this state right now. So I think we're going to see a push even further to the right as we think about the UNC Board of Governors in 2019.
Which again, whoever's in charge of the General Assembly appoints the Board of Governors. So, you know, that's another thing that might drive it. Certainly, I mean, I don't know if that's a vote driving thing, but voters should be aware that the decision for the head of the UNC system is chosen by those members.
Yeah, and the Republicans will probably stay in charge of the board for at least the next year or so, even if Democrats had a really good year this year. But you could see the pendulum swing back the other way a little bit further down the road when some new appointments are made and perhaps gets a little bit less conservative. All
right, quick. We got a minute left. I want to get some quick. If where you're comfortable,
sure.
Quick predictions. Along someone get you on film. Do you think that? So, what do you think Democrats are going to do in the General Assembly? You think they are going to take either chamber or break the supermajority, Colin?
I think they may be able to break the supermajority, particularly in the House. I think it would be a really, really long shot for them to take the majority.
What about the constitutional amendments? What do you think? That's been kind of historically, they all pass when they get on the ballot.
Historically, since this Constitution has been ratified, I think it's like 83% of amendments have been approved. My gut still says that all 6 will get through, maybe a couple with pretty thin margins. But it is interesting as we think about those executive power constitutional amendments. The governors have spoken out against them. Americans for Prosperity have spoken out against them. So perhaps those are in a little bit of trouble.
Great. Thanks so much. Good insights, great conversation, and good seeing both of you. After the break, this week's Leadership Spotlight.